So today's um, teaching is of Psalm 90. And this psalm is one that many of us know because it's often recited at funerals. Now, the reason it's recited at funerals is because it reminds us in a famous line, 1,000 years in your eyes are like a day, that all of our lives are limited. And that's a key theme of this psalm, that in contrast to God, who transcends time, our lives are finite. In translating this psalm, there is a lot of room for challenge. And the copy you received, I needed to get this out to Helene Coulter, who I am so dependent on to get out the mailings by 4 o'clock yesterday. And needless to say, I did a lot more work later in the day and even this morning. And in part, what today will focus in on, I'll share with you some of the choices of translation as a way to dig deeper into the poetic art, and then to highlight what the overall message is. But with that, if you've printed out the mailing, which some of you do just to have the text in front of you that I send with the letter, you will have it as a point of reference to note the struggle with this translation. Struggle in the best sense, rare words used in novel ways, the art of poetry. So let me, without more, a shorter psalm than yesterday. Yesterday, again, was the third of longest of the psalms. This one's more standard in length. And again, I tend to choose for the title a phrase. In this case, I chose a phrase that is both best known, but also because the theme of this psalm, Psalm 90, is the contrast between our finite years and God's infinity. I'll say again before I begin to read, a prayer of Moses. This is the only psalm of 150 that is attributed to Moses. Moses, normally we think of it as King David. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, that important commentator, he said that David found the manuscript of Moses. Again, David Kimchi lived in Narbonne, France, 1160 to 1235. And he would say that David found a collection of 11 Psalms, an old manuscript. And this is one of them. In fact, traditional commentators will say that although not attributed to Moses, beyond this, the next 10 Psalms will also be from that manuscript and Moses Psalms. Not everybody says that. There is, for others who say that this, based on Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon was a very important teacher, born in Egypt, moved to Baghdad where he would become the head of the academy in the 10th century. And Saadia Gaon says a prayer of Moses refers to the descendants of Moses who were well-known musicians in the court, and that too Radak will note as a possibility. But what gets picked up popularly in medieval commentators is that this is the psalm of no less than Moshe Rabbeinu. And I'll add one more little phrase, and then I'll read. The phrase, Ish ha-Elohim, a man of God, which clearly is not Moses referring to himself, but to the psalmist. That phrase occurs in Deuteronomy chapter 33. It's the only time it occurs. Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 1. It's Moses' farewell song. It's the end of the Torah. And before the song is sung, it says, and this was by Moses, Isha Elohim, which would, for the psalmist, perhaps indicate that this was a poem written honoring agedness, maturity of years, a perspective on life from the cusp of life. All right, that's by way of introduction to the only psalm called Tfilah LeMoshe, in which Moses' name, in this case a prayer of Moses, is part of the title. A prayer of Moses, man of God, my supreme, a refuge. You have been for us from generation to generation. Before the mountains were born, and you had writhed in birthing the earth and habitable land from everlasting to everlasting, you are El. You return a human being to crush dust, and you say, return, children of Adam. For 1,000 years in your eyes are like a day of yesterday, which passes, and is a watch in the night. You stream them along, asleep are they, in the morning like grass sprouting. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts, toward evening it withers and dries up. For we are consumed by your fury, and by your wrath we are terrified. You have placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins for the light of your face. For all our days pass away under your anger. We consume our years like a mutterance. The days of our years, and them are 70, and if with great might 80 years, and their pride is toil and fatigue, for shorn quickly and we fly away. Who can know the strength of your fury? And as you are feared, so is your anger. To number our days rightly, instruct, and we will acquire a heart of wisdom. Return, Adonai, how long? Bring comfort upon your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your kindness, and we will sing gladly and rejoice in all our days. Make us rejoice according to the days that you afflicted us, the years that we saw evil. Let appear to your servants your deeds and your beauty upon their children. And may the delight of our supreme, our God, be upon us, and the work of our hands establish upon us, and the work of our hands establish it. As I'm reading it, I'm making mental notes of all the tweaks along the way and all the thinking. So let me share with you some of those translation issues. Verse 1, when it says, Hayita lanu, let me back up. Adonai ma'onata. That's the introduction. Adonai could be my master. I choose supreme because it's more gender-based and is elevating rather than dominating. My supreme, the key word here is ma'on. Ma'on is a word used on one other place in Psalms as a lion's lair, meaning a place where one is concealed away and protected. That's the other use of the word ma'on, which is to say that we dwell within God. God is our protecting place, our, if you will, makom. One of the words the rabbis chose in the Talmud to describe God is hamakom, that which is the place in which all dwells. Pointing, it's worth noting what's not mentioned in this psalm, and that is the temple, not mentioned. Sacrifice, ritual, not mentioned. This is a poem about God and Moses. And you have to know, Moses had a relationship with God even before there was a structure. God's relationship with Moses was face to face. And so here there's this quality about this relationship. Unlike many psalms that are the longing for the temple, this is simply about our own passing years and God's infinity, and it's infinity that's the next phrase. Hayita lanu bedor v'dor. You have been with us from, now this will get translated as from eternity to eternity. Oh, that'll come up, from everlasting to everlasting. But you've been with us from, across generations. And now verse 2 emphasizing God's eternity, but using language in verse 2 that otherwise is that of childbirthing. This is even going beyond most anthropomorphisms. We often speak of God in Psalms and in Torah in human-like language. What's dramatic here, and I'll share with you how the different translations are a little embarrassed to translate it. I have so many translations that I prepared. So here I got it. So verse 2, before the mountains were born, okay, Yoludu is again to give birth, were born, you, see, vit cholel eretz v'tevel. I translated as the way cholel. This word came up recently. It's a rare word. Cholel, I had it in a previous psalm last week, was whirling dances. So the cholel has the sense of motion, usually, and it's often understood as birth pangs, writhing in pain. You see a woman moving as she's giving birth. That's the word cholel. It has this motion to it, like the Khalil. Remember I talked about the Khalil being the flute and the sense of the motion. And so so here's some different ways that gets translated. I kept it with the literal. I kind of like this extreme anthropomorphism of God as mother, giving birth to creation, writhing in birthing the earth. Because again, cholel is the context of motion, of movement. So here's what others kind of soften it. Brought forth. Some would say not yet convulsed, like an ArtScroll, but convulsion, maybe because my wife's an epileptologist, for me is an epileptic seizure. So I'm not into convulsions. So I didn't like the word convulse. And it literally, again, means writhing in the birthing process, writhing because of the motion. Some soften it, like Martin Cohen, to say conceived, but that's even before there was birth. And this is a description of birth. Popularly, it's translated as you had labored the earth and habitable land. Labor meaning giving birth, but without the sense of the motion. That's a step too far. So they kind of clean it up, if you will. So hence a choice I made to convey something dramatic for me. The image of God birthing the earth and writhing, moving. But I love that dynamic, and that's the paradox of this psalm. God has given human-like metaphor and simultaneously is everlasting to everlasting. Me'olam ad olam. Some translate as from eternity to eternity, or listen to ArtScroll, from before the world until the end of the world, adding to the image. But for me, from everlasting to everlasting means infinite. It's the way olam ad olam ata'el, from everlasting to everlasting, from eternity, from as a matter of infinity, you are El. So verse 2 is so powerful for me. This contrast between anthropomorphism and otherness. And that, I think, defines our relationship with God. I mean, just speaking to God, just writing a psalm to God implies that you can have a conversation with God. That's a quality of anthropomorphism. God is the other to whom we speak. And yet, in speaking to God, we acknowledge that God is not like us. And next verse, for 1,000 years in your eyes are like a day of yesterday, which passes and is a watch in the night. many translations, but here in Hebrew, this one I finally solved. Okay, which passes, and as a watch in the night. So this is decreasing, because the watch in the night, ashmora, is a technical term, which is a third of the night in the Talmud. There would be the Levite watches, the Kohen watches. So it goes from 1,000 years to a day to a third of a night, which is to say, our years are so short, and we humans live with so little awareness of the brevity of our lives. You stream them along, ziram tam, many translations, because it's an unusual phrase. Some will say you flood them, or you draw them into sleep. You stream them along. Asleep are they, meaning we, people, are oblivious to how the years are going by. In the morning, like grass sprouting. So there's the sense of the freshness in youth, of sprouting forth. In the morning, and now for emphasis, it repeats it. In the morning, it flourishes and sprouts. Toward evening, it withers and dries up. That's a metaphor you've seen elsewhere in Scripture, and also a kind of a metaphor identified another reason this psalm is read at graveside. But now the psalm gets a little bit hard, this middle part. For we are consumed by your fury, and by your wrath are terrified. And a commentator pointed out that this sounds like fire, and this follows, the grass is now all dried up, and then there's the fire of God, which just makes it combustible. So that's the sequence of this flow. For we are consumed by your fury, and by your wrath we are terrified. So we live our lives aware of our fragility, if we are aware, and God's power. And in some sense, and now verse 8 explains why God is angry. You have placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins for the light of your face. And there's the notion of secret sins, a very unusual word, alumenu, which can also be alim, can sound like violence. Our secret sins for the light of your face. And now back to framing that. See, so verse 8 is framed on either side by God's anger. For our days pass away under your anger. We consume our years like a mutterance. Here's a word, hege. Hege yomam v'layla usually is translated in other contexts as an utterance or even as meditation. Popularly, in some of the translations I've looked at, it's a sigh, kind of suggestive of Kohelet with breath is hevel, vanity. But I chose mutterance, that's somewhat original, because the image, sometimes it's hege is the moving of the lips, but without making intelligible conversation as how it's usually used. And there's the sense that our words also aren't necessarily purposeful and impactful. They're like muttering. We consume our years like a mutterance. When we're unconscious of our limited years and the purpose of our lives, it's just like our words aren't being purposeful. The years, and now emphasizing our own fragility, the days of our years, this took a while to figure out for me, to put dashes. And again, my choice is to translate as literally as I can and leave the ambiguity. The days of our years, in them are 70 years, and with great might 80 years. And it's pointed out that if Moses is writing this, the actual Moses, who lives to 120, then the 70 and 80, that's kind of a tension in it really being the man Moses. Nonetheless, back to this. But this was typical then and remarkable now. Even though people died earlier in antiquity, my brother, the doctor, pointed out if you got past all the childhood diseases and you got past the wars, you more or less lived till, 70-ish. More or less the same as in our lives some 20, 30 years ago. And their pride, and this is Kohelet-like, so more Kohelet, which is why Ecclesiastes, why people often choose to make Hege a sigh or a breath. And their pride is toil and fatigue. Though the word aven, again, is a little obscure in this context, Meiri, an important translator, would say it is painful weariness, so fatigue, for shorn quickly. And the word gaz is the word used for shoring a sheep, which goes back to the image of the drying up, the sense of moving things forward, for shorn quickly, and we fly away. And back to this image. See, now we keep bouncing back from this image of God's anger. Who can know the strength of your fury? And as you are feared, so is your anger. The commentators are a little troubled by this last piece. And as you are feared, so is your anger. Now, again, most Psalms were read in exile. And this Psalm 2, understandably, was read as, why do we continue to suffer in exile? Why are you so angry to keep us here? And they would say, the closer you are to God, think of the prophet Amos, who says of Israel, essentially, for misdemeanors I punish you, for felonies I punish all my other children. And so here, the rabbis often comment to the closer we are to you, the more you judge us with sensitivity of what are our possibilities. Hence, and as you are feared, the more you are a focus, so is your anger, so is your expectations adjusted to have high expectations. And now to pull this to its close, now we ask God for guidance to number our days or to count our days, Cain, rightly. Hoda, instruct. V'navei levav chachma, and we will acquire a heart of wisdom. That too is a popular line. Number our days rightly, instruct, and we will acquire a heart of wisdom. Here too, my translation is literal and my own. I didn't find that phrasing in the translations, which try to smooth it over a little bit, so that they're usually like, teach us to number our days with meaning. They'll add a few words. So it's not just the number, but emphasizing a life of meaning. And now we say, and again, you can hear simultaneously the sense of exile in verse 13, and you can hear as well the sense of what the psalmist is longing for is closeness to God. Despite a life that is fleeting, there is the yearning for closeness to the infinite. Return, Adonai, exclamation. How long, dash, 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 will you be distant? Bring comfort. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, the prophet chanted to the exiles. Comfort, comfort, be my people. Bring comfort upon your servants. And again, this is now speaking on behalf, these are the words of a psalmist on behalf of community. Satisfy us in the morning with your kindness, and we will sing gladly and rejoice in all our days. Be in that relationship with us. Make us rejoice according to the days that you afflicted us, the years that we saw evil. Again, back to the image of exile. For all the years we were in exile, may we celebrate in our land. Or simply turn from affliction to enable our rejoicing through your leading, through your teaching. Let appear to your servants your deeds and your beauty upon their children. Now, again, it's an old person, perhaps, in terms of the phrase, Isha Elohim. And so there's now this shifting to upon their children, the next generation. And here's a subtlety in the closing line. And may the delight, the word noam, like hinema tovu manayim, manayim means pleasant, how goodly it is, how pleasant it is. That word naim, delight, in the Bible is only used in the context of relationships. It's the delight of a relationship, not just like pretty, aesthetically. And may the delight of our supreme, and I chose delight, that also is distinctive as a choice. And I like the image of light because we're back. This takes us, look at this. This is the brilliance of this poetry. Look at this word, noam, right? See, verse 17, the second word. Go to the very beginning. Ma'on. That's the same letters but backwards. Na'im and ma'on. So the refuge turned upside down becomes delight. That's purposeful. That's the poetry of coming for an inclusio that's kind of poetic. Vayihi noam, suggestive of, again, ma'on, noam. May the delight of our Supreme our God be upon us, and the work of our hands establish upon us. That means even though our lives may be fragile and fleeting, at least let our work be enduring. The work konena is often translated as steadfast. The image of establish, which is how it's usually used, is that it becomes enduring. So, and the work of our hands, let it be enduring upon us. And here's the last comment. And the work of our hands, you see, it's repeating, right? The work of our hands, establish. But first it's upon us. And then distinctly, the last syllable of the psalm is establish it. Now that could either be for emphasis, or Benjamin Siegel, who I so value, says, again, it's an older person saying, if you don't establish it for us, at least establish it, for our children. I can't count on you doing it so fast for me to establish it for us, but at least establish it so that the next generation, back to children of verse 16, it'll be there for them. In sum, to pull this together, this is a calling for refuge and delight. That same word, ma'on and noam, with the in-between acknowledging that in contrast to God, in whom our lives are lived, and at best are lived with delight, the light of God. Our years are fleeting. We are mortal. We are the children of Adam. Adam, identified with the sin in the Garden of Eden. For we have hidden sins. We have things we do wrong. And we know, God, you are watching and that you expect more of us precisely because we yearn for closeness to you. Nonetheless, be close to us. How much longer will we feel your distance? Embrace us. And last, even though our lives are fleeting, may what we do with our lives, may that be enduring. All right, that's a riff on the meaning of the flow I shared today in honor of Shirley. I'm so delighted to be able to honor Shirley today. The sense that, if I had another hour, I could, kind of put up and share all the various translations of these words I've pointed out, which again is the nature of poetry. And that is, words are used in often novel ways, often rare words that lead to different possibilities. With that, I eagerly await some of your thoughts or reactions to Psalm 90? Alex, go right ahead.
First comment I'd like to make is I've found verse 4 to be very useful in discussing science with a young Earth creationist. When they insist that a day is a day, I say a day is 1,000 years. Look, here's your biblical proof. And
Oh, that's very nice in terms of somebody who's a literalist. Yeah.
yeah, and then as to the very last verse, verse 17.
Yes.
It's my understanding is that we're praying that God allow us to take part in the work of salvation. That the God allows us to make this the work of our hands.
That's
As well
beautiful.
as just bringing down.
That's beautiful and added a dimension to what I shared. Thank you, Alex. Let me respond to the two things you shared. One is this line, for 1,000 years in your eyes is like a day of yesterday. On Tuesday next week, we're all in for a treat in that I'm honoring Amy Robinson Katz, who many of you know from our services. She's a magnificent writer of music to Psalms. And she told me a story in regard to having written a song. She was busy this morning. I checked in with her, but she was busy. She wrote music to the line Alex just quoted, for 1,000 years in your eyes are like a day. And she said what prompted her to write that particular melody, and this line of Psalms came to her, is she was up in the redwoods looking at a cut tree and saw that 1,000 years was like two fingers in terms of the rings around the tree. And for her, the image of 1,000 years being two fingers in that context, she found very moving. And it made her think about how, from God's perspective, time is very different than it would be for us. So, bottom line, maybe I'll talk her into even singing that line next week as well. Psalm 91, which I'll be honoring her next week, she mentioned was her favorite psalm, and she's written music for that. So I'll leave time for her to do some singing on Tuesday next week. The last comment you made, Alex, I delight in terms of what it suggests. And again, it suggests because that's the nature of poetry. It's not prose, it's suggestive, is may the delight of our Supreme be upon us. And then the same phrase, upon us, I'm now adding to your comment, Alex, and the work of our hands establish upon us, which means the upon us, which in Hebrew is aleinu, is suggestive of partnership with God. That when we are working, God's light is upon us and our work is upon us. And that's back to God. Quality of partnership by the repetition of that word aleinu for both God and our work. I haven't seen that in the commentaries, but it pops to the foreground, building on what you just shared, Alex, in terms of circling the word aleinu, upon us, and how it's used both for God and our work, equaling partnership. Thank you. All right. Another comment? Irene, go
Sure.
ahead.
I just remembered that Ibn Ezra quotes that line in Psalm 90 to prove that A, the world was not made for man, like most of the Midrashic thinkers thought, and also that you cannot take the creation story literally, which your other, gentleman that spoke just said. So he actually said you cannot take the creation in 6 days because of like what you said about the tree, that, we might think of it, and he uses it in conjunction with Proverbs 8:22. And I was blown away when I saw that, it goes against what all the Midrash. So the world, we are just specks of dust, he said. And why should God have made the world for us, sort of thing, more than anything else? But it's mainly that world, the days that are talked about are not days as we think of them, you know.
Yeah. Well, Irene, thank you. Now, again, because I'm so delighting by the diversity in our class, both in terms of our own backgrounds, but as well as physically. And I'll just want to say for context, Irene is joining us from Manchester, England. We met through a CSP lecture on Elie Wiesel, and I'm delighted to have with Zoom Irene join us. And she's also a scholar who has written on Ibn Ezra. So just to give everybody context, something I delighted in, Irene, if you go to Wikipedia for Ibn Ezra, there are now 2 different choices of his birth and death in order to equal 75 years. So there's more than one date. So Ibn Ezra was a commentator born in Tudela, Spain,
Yes, that's right.
would die in Calahorra.
No, died in England. No.
Oh, he died in England. Oh.
Yes, he was murdered. He was murdered. If somebody's ordered my book from your on Kindle in your Kahila, so you know my book is available in every university library in America. So
put it up, Irene. Put it into the chat or email it to
I'll
me.
email you. I don't want to look as I'm
Email it to me.
saying, but my book, I mean, you know, is regarded as one of the most sort of comprehensive in English, and it does a lot on the his history. It's not Kalahora. He didn't go back. He was going further north all the time to bring the good news of Hebrew to the Ashkenazim, and he was very Sephardi. And I don't know if you know. Do you know Rabbi Mark Angel in America?
Yes, I do, from the Spanish Portuguese synagogue.
Yeah, so he's just done something today on Ibn Ezra. It was another person on his very good emails, and he said the right dates, 1089 to 1164. It's a fact.
Great. Well, because of limitation on time, I'm going to again thank Irene, pull this together, and I'm delighted, Irene, by what you just shared in terms of Ibn Ezra's comment, building on Alex's, that verse 4, I'll repeat it, for 1,000 years in your eyes are like a day of yesterday, which passes, and as a watch in the night. For Ibn Ezra, already in the 12th century, was stating that unlike many of the Midrashim, to echo Irene's insight of Ibn Ezra, that the world, you know, is not to be so anthrocentric, not so focused on humans, that it is much bigger than that, and that the time frame is not to be taken in the creation story literally, that God's time is not our time. So when the Bible speaks about day 1 and day 2, it's not talking about sunrise to sunset. And I will add, the sun and moon aren't put in the sky until the 4th day. So that already for Ibn Ezra, long before the Scopes trial in America. Irene, you don't know about the Scopes trial in America probably. There was a trial in America about the need, about teaching evolution, and whether that was science, you know, because there were the creationists who said it's not what the Bible teaches. So in sum, I'm going to pull it together because it's already 10:13. I'm mindful of time. I want to thank Alex and Irene for your prompts. I'm bemoaning the fact that there isn't more time. I'm sure there would be much more prompted. Shirley, thumbs, you want me to pull it together, or do you want to say a word? Up to you.
I'd like you to pull it together, but I'd like to thank you for your kindness, Rabbi Spitz.
Oh, you're most welcome, Shirley. And again, today's learning was dedicated to Shirley, but she chose this date in part to honor the 86th anniversary of her parents. Her parents born in Cleveland, born in the Carpathia, but came to America at the age of 16, each individually, in a time in which you could not see your parents afterwards. Travel wasn't like today. And I mentioned that Shirley went to Israel in 1970. It would be the first opportunity her father would have to reunite with a brother and a sister after much of his life, 50 years having passed. So we honor that anniversary. We honor Shirley. I invite Anybody who has a Kaddish honoring a loved one, I see Harris, who is honoring the memory of his son Noah, and others, if you are, we join together. Yitkadal
Gazal,
v'yitkadash
Kadash,
shemei rabbah
Rabba,
Amen.
alma divrak kirute
Kirate,
v'yamlich
Yamlich,
malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon u'chayei dechol beit Yisrael
Israel,
ba'agala u'bizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei
Hey,
Rabba Mivrach Le'olam Le'omaya
Maya.
Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitba'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei D'Kudusha B'richu Le'ela Mikol Birchata Shirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Damiran Bialma Vibru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Lama Rabba Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei
Shalom.
Shalom B'mramav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom
Shalom.
Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen.
Amen.
My gratitude to everybody. Next week, Psalm 91. The Psalms that we're now in the 90s are in our Sidurim. And I think of my teacher, Rabbi Shalom Podwal, who asks about the location of prayers and verses. So know that each of the Psalms here in the 90s are also in our Sidurim. To prepare for today, for instance, I looked at the commentary in Sidur Lev Shalem. In that regard, I look forward to next week. The Psalm for Shabbat is next week, among others, 9:30 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. To each of us, blessings of Shabbat Shalom. Shirley, thank you for being part of our class. To
you.
each of you, much gratitude.